Joining us on this Monday afternoon. For those of you who haven't met me before, my name is Becky Scott and I am the Project Manager for Workforce Development at Libraries Connected. This afternoon's webinar is part of a selection of webinars that are all about thought-provoking discussions, provocations around a particular theme, and they arose from some of the discussions that came out of our annual seminar. This one is about libraries as neutral spaces, and we'll be welcoming doctoral researcher John Pateman, who is doing a collaborative PhD with the University of Leicester and the British Library. We had our first webinar from David McEnemy, and we were looking at ethics and freedom of access to information and the role that we play as library workers in maintaining those kind of ethical principles around our collections and our users. We also had last week or week before, we had a really interesting webinar around social cohesion and the role of libraries as community connectors. And I'm sure you all found that social cohesion research really interesting and contemporary. Today's webinar is really focused on a piece of older research, but that now looking forward to what has happened since that research and really understanding the context of where we've come from and where we might be going next. So just a few little things of housekeeping before we move on to welcome John to the floor. So first of all, please keep yourself muted while John is speaking so that he can concentrate and there's not a lot of distraction for our attendees. Of course, there will be time for questions at the end of the webinar, so please jot them down. You might want to make some reflections in the chat or use the Q&A function. The first time we're having a go with that, so please bear with us if it doesn't quite go to plan. So do have a go using the Q&A function, and of course at the end I'll be inviting people to ask their question. You can come on camera or you can just ask your question in the chat. Is there anything I have forgotten? Yes, we are recording the webinar, but we'll record the presentation section and we don't record the Q&A, and we will be sharing the slides and the recording after the webinar. Okay, I think that is everything. So I will hand over to John, and I hope you find this presentation thought-provoking and that there's lots of discussion. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thanks, Becky, and hello, everybody. Good to see so many people here. I'm wondering how many of you were around when I was last Chief Librarian in the UK over 10 years ago. And I was very happy to be invited to talk about the open to all research that I was involved in 25 years ago, because it featured quite strongly in my most recent book, which was published earlier this year, Reimagining Public Libraries, published by Facet, where I took a 25-year look back to that piece of research and reflected on its relevance then and its relevance today. And I'm going to do the same in this session, and I'm also going to connect it to my current research, which is looking at the relationship between the public library and the community it serves. So just a quick recap on my journey here. I studied as a library assistant in London Borough of Bromley, 1978, worked my way up the ranks through the various library services in London, then became head of libraries in Hackney and Merton, and then had a big culture shift when I moved to Lincolnshire, which was a bigger library system, but also a very different way of working there. And I finished my career as the Chief Librarian and CEO of Thunder Bay Public Library in Canada. What links all of these experiences together is my abiding interest in social exclusion, on people who need libraries the most but use them the least, our non-users. And some of these library services I managed have won awards, like the Libraries Change Lives Awards in Merton for working with asylum seekers. Also the Library Change Lives Award in Lincolnshire for our work with migrant workers, and another award in Canada for the library's work with Indigenous people. So this has been an abiding area of interest for me throughout my career. In terms of my expertise, I suppose we can start back in 1999 when I was invited to become part of the group that put together some guidance for public libraries on social inclusion. And that piece of work was sponsored by Chris Smith, who was the culture secretary at that time. And then the following year, I was involved in this open to all. And the most important part of this title is the question mark. Open, are we open to all? Question mark. The public library and social exclusion, which is going to form, at least half of my presentation. What's interesting when we look back 25 years, we had a new Labour government then. It was under Tony Blair. They had a social inclusion unit actually inside the Cabinet Office. And there was a lot of interest in social exclusion and how public libraries could address it. I'm not so sure today whether the latest Labour government is so interested in these issues, but I think it's worth reminding them that public libraries do have a critical role to play in tackling social exclusion and building community cohesion, etc. So the research was part of a wider programme looking at the value and impact of libraries. And the research was led by academics at the School of Information, at Leeds Metropolitan University. But critically, I think, they chose to involve practitioners in the research, people who were working in the library service. I was head of libraries in Merton at that time. And we had also people there from Sheffield Library. So it was a nice blend of academic and practitioner-led research, which is why I think people kind of paid attention to it. It wasn't just people in ivory towers writing about things that they don't really know about. That's the new world I live in, by the way, academia. So the research process was in kind of 3 stages. The research team went away and did their own research and came up with some working papers on various aspects of social exclusion. So, for example, I wrote a working paper on public libraries and social class, looking at their use and non-use of public libraries by the working class. We also did a major survey of every library authority in the country. We got a very good response rate, and this really gave us some insight into the work that was happening at that time in public libraries around social exclusion, and also the work that wasn't happening. And also we did some in-depth case studies, and I was privileged to go out to Northern Ireland and look at the situation in Northern Ireland, which was interesting in 2008. It was not long after the Good Friday Agreement and the peace process, and looking at how libraries there were one of the few places where both traditions could come together in the same space. The library there was a neutral space. So that was the process. The objectives, what were we trying to achieve? I guess you could look at this as a kind of a gap analysis. We knew there was a problem, which was social exclusion. We knew that public libraries were potentially part of the solution to that problem, obviously never the total solution. And so we wanted to look at ways that libraries were addressing social exclusion at that time. We wanted to see whether they were focusing their services on excluded people or whether they were taking a more universal approach. And also we wanted to, I think, and this is where the relevance today comes in, suggest how libraries can build inclusive communities, particularly at this moment in time when society seems to be getting even more divided and divisive. So that's what we tried to achieve. The challenges were really more of a set of hypotheses. Our desk research, for example, suggested that working class people and other socially excluded people weren't making good use of public libraries as a fantastic free resource. We also found that in libraries themselves, there wasn't a lot of knowledge amongst library workers about the government's social inclusion agenda. And there wasn't a lot of work being done with non-users to see what their needs were. And also we spotted a number of barriers that existed. And of course, none of these barriers were put into place intentionally by public libraries, but nonetheless, they were there. At that time, they were, for example, around fines and those kind of issues, which I know a lot of us, or a lot of libraries, have now moved away from. So those are the challenges that libraries faced in terms of tackling social exclusion. And from the survey, which was the major kind of source of information that came in, to sort of summarize, I mean, you can see some detail on these slides here in terms of percentages, etc. But in general, the survey told us, and people were very honest, of course, in responding to the survey, that there was no real focus amongst public libraries at that time on social exclusion and getting socially excluded people engaged with the library. Most public libraries were still offering what I would call a traditional service that focused mainly on existing users and kind of keeping the existing users happy, keeping them coming into the library. And there was relatively little attempts to go beyond that kind of inner circle of library users to the next circle, which was kind of potential library users, maybe people who'd used the library in the past but had stopped for whatever reason, kind of lapsed users, and certainly no attempt to go to the outer circle where the non-users resided, even though it was the non-users possibly who needed the library the most. So those were some of the key findings, that social exclusion really wasn't a priority within public libraries at that time. And you could argue, on one hand, it should have been. Why wasn't it? On the other hand, if we look at the previous government that was there before the new Labour came into power, there was no focus there on social exclusion either. So we know that libraries have to follow kind of national government trends as well as meeting local priorities. Similarly, in the case studies, we found there was a lack of kind of coordination across public libraries. Public libraries weren't kind of joined up in their view of social exclusion and what they should do with it. There was no overarching kind of policy framework, strategies, or thinking. And I remember myself at that time as a head of libraries, when I raised this issue in Chief Librarians forums, various forums, there wasn't a lot of interest, frankly, in taking this agenda forward. There was no targeting of resources. It was still very much felt, we offer everything to everybody, and it's kind of up to them whether they take it or not. Staff were not particularly knowledgeable. There weren't training programs like there are now around these kind of issues. They weren't prepared to deal with socially excluded people who came into the library. And that's a big part of it, I think, is preparation for these kind of programs. And there was no targeting of programs were put on, and it was just assumed that every program would somehow kind of magically also address exclusion without that focus. The working papers also threw up some additional findings that kind of reinforced the survey and the case studies. There was no consultation, kind of consistent, organized consultation with non-users or outreach to non-users. It was kind of sporadic. Maybe it was spurred on by some external funding that came their way or by a partnership opportunity. The service was pretty passive in terms of access. It was kind of open the doors and see who comes in. It wasn't particularly proactive or interventionist in trying to get more and different people into the library. And there was a view that technology could solve a lot of problems, a bit of a silver bullet, a bit of a panacea, a lot of emphasis on modernization. And we did see, of course, investment in the People's Network, and we saw a lot of new kit going into libraries, but it wasn't targeted, again, that key word, particularly at excluded communities. It was a kind of universal offer. I'm sure there's still big discussions today amongst libraries connected in this tension between the universal and the targeted approach to service delivery. So out of all of that, to boil all of that down, all of those findings, all of that research, the case studies, the working papers, the survey, we suggested very strongly that much more than modernisation was needed. In fact, we felt that if public libraries were really going to get to grips with this issue of social exclusion, they had to be more proactive, they had to be more interventionist and educative, and they had to have a concern for social justice at its core. And I think this is where contentious issues start to arise when this kind of language is used amongst public libraries. It's not necessarily part of the public library tradition. Social justice starts to kind of bump up against this idea of neutrality. Social justice often means backing a group of people, taking a side, and that doesn't sit easily with neutrality. So this was the key message that came out of the research, and then let's explore kind of what happened next, because unlike other research and other reports that have been written on public libraries, and I'm sure you've all got shelves full of these, groaning under the weight of various projects that have looked into public libraries from various institutions, government, etc. I've certainly got a shelf full here. Often they come out, there's a bit of a noise around them. Maybe there's a seminar based on them or a conference to discuss their findings. And then, frankly, they go back on the shelf and they gather dust and nothing kind of fundamentally changes. Well, as a research team, we were determined that that wouldn't happen. We were determined that our research would have a legacy, that there would be some action coming out of it. And so we formed what was initially known as the Social Exclusion Action Planning Network. And this was a voluntary group of public libraries who wanted to come together in the network and share their experiences of tackling social exclusion, talking about their services, their programs, their collections, their staff training. And because it was very early days, it was very much people learning from each other and sometimes doing things for the first time. And if they succeeded, sharing that information, or if they didn't succeed, sharing, the lessons learned. So that was established in 2000, immediately after the research was published, and it is still going to this day, which I think in itself is an achievement. It did change its name from this rather clumsy Social Exclusion Action Planning Network to just the network. And the person who's kept it going all that time is John Vincent, who I'm sure many of you are aware of. He was a former Chief Librarian in Lambeth, and he's kept this going. He's run training programs. He puts out an excellent newsletter and bulletin every month, which captures all the information you need as a head of libraries to be on top of the social exclusion agenda. But of course, it's changed names and emphasis over time. The other really interesting development, which we didn't see kind of coming, was that the open to all research was taken up in Canada by a chief librarian in Vancouver, who was very kind of energized when he read the report, the detailed report, and he put in a bid to the federal government for some federal funding to pilot the open to all recommendations, to implement those recommendations across 4 library systems in Canada. So it was Vancouver, Halifax, Edmonton and Toronto. And they had enough money from the federal government to appoint community librarians, new staff brought in with community development type skills, whose job was to lead this work of implementing open to all in those public libraries. And that project was funded for 4 years. It was called the Working Together Project. I was invited out there a couple of times to make presentations, for example, at the Vancouver Public Library Staff Conference, a 2-day event, and also at the Canadian Library Association Conference in Ottawa, and kind of spread the word about open to all. And that's part of the reason why I ended up working in Canada from 2012 to 2022, because I knew that Canadian public libraries had taken the findings, the recommendations from Open to All, and they had implemented them quite successfully. Not every public library in Canada, I'd hasten to add, and some more than others. Edmonton Library in particular fully embraced Open to All and made it their kind of new way of working, transformed their public libraries in the process. So that was a really interesting development to have it running in 2 countries at once. And also there was some exchange between the 2 countries in terms, again, of lessons learned, good practice, etc. And then myself and John Vincent in 2010 published a book with Routledge called Public Libraries and Social Justice, where we basically documented the Open to All process and what came out of it, including the network and including this work in Canada. So that was a kind of snapshot in 2010 of where public libraries were with the social exclusion agenda. I then followed that up in 2013 with another book, Developing Community-Led Public Libraries. And this was co-written by myself, who by then was head of libraries in Thunder Bay, with one of these community development librarians I mentioned just now, Ken Willimant, who worked in Halifax Library. And so we looked at these developments in public libraries in Canada and the UK, this kind of move away from the traditional model, more towards the community-led library. And again, we documented all that, because I think it's important that we do things in public libraries, but it's equally important that we write about them, whether it's in professional journals or in this case as books, not only for the current at the time, the contemporary librarians to inform on the subject, but also as a legacy for librarians today. So that takes me to the next kind of step in my career, which was Thunder Bay Public Library. And I knew when I went to, I'd never heard of Thunder Bay, incidentally, before I moved to Canada. It's literally right in the centre of the country, right in the middle of Canada, in northwestern Ontario, on the shores of Lake Superior. It's a beautiful setting. However, it has got a number of serious challenges. It's what they call over there a blue collar community, so it's mostly working class. And as we found in the UK, getting working class people to use libraries can be a challenge. But also, and this was a new challenge for me, was that Thunder Bay had the highest per capita Indigenous population of any city in Canada. So 15% of Thunder Bay's 100,000 population was Indigenous. And I'd never worked with an Indigenous community before, and I didn't fully understand the issues around that, because I hadn't lived in a settler colonial country before. I'd worked with, as I mentioned earlier, asylum seekers, migrant workers in the UK, but of course the Indigenous population is the original population who've been displaced, who've had their land stolen, and sometimes their children put into residential schools. Those kind of issues, I hadn't tackled in my career as a chief librarian in the UK. So it really was a steep learning curve, never mind the cultural differences between Britain and Canada. Of course, we share the same monarchy. The Queen's head was on the $20 bill, that kind of thing. But also Canada leans very, very strongly towards America. And that also brought in some interesting cultural influences. So I did my usual thing as a Chief Librarian, which was to first of all start off with the strategy. How were we going to tackle the issue of non-use of the library by working class and Indigenous people? And we decided to centre our strategy not on social exclusion, but on anti-racism and decolonisation. And that became the driving force for everything that we did over the next 10 years, which led to the transformation of Thunder Bay Public Library from a traditional public library into a community-led and a needs-based library. So we started with that strategy, and we went through a kind of three-stage process of, first of all, unfreezing what we called unfreezing the culture of the library, which was frozen around this notion of settler colonialism and colonization, which is a living, it's an ongoing issue. It's not a historical issue. It's happening today, and we unfroze that approach by putting staff through a very vigorous anti-racism program, which was called intercultural competence development. So it was about how can we develop the competence, the cultural competence of our staff to deal with other cultures, and in particular, the Indigenous culture. So if you like, this was the preparation stage. We prepared our staff for what was to come next, which was going to be an influx of working class and Indigenous people. Then we went through the change process itself, and this involved, for example, taking the recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which reported in 2015, and applying those to the public library context. That led to us establishing an Indigenous Council, whereby Indigenous folk came to the top table, sat around the management table and informed us and educated us and advised us on what we needed to do. That also led to us creating positions for the first time filled by Indigenous people. It had been an all-white workforce when I arrived there. And I think a big part of tackling social exclusion is to hire people who've had lived experience of being excluded. And then we established Indigenous knowledge centres in every library. We abandoned the Dewey system, the Eurocentric view of the world. We abandoned that, and we recentered the Indigenous view of the world through these Indigenous knowledge centres. And then, having changed the system, we refroze it, and we did that through establishing partnerships with a wide range of Indigenous organisations, giving them space in the library. So we had a wonderful organisation called the Anishinaabe Employment and Training Service, which was there to get Indigenous people into employment and training. And we gave them space in the library, physical space, rent-free. And their staff worked with our staff. We trained each other effectively in each other's work and created this joined up service. So that was, I think, I like to think that that's an example of taking the findings of the open to all research and applying them in a very kind of deep and meaningful way in the library, redirecting resources, changing the staffing structure, being driven by a strategy that's relentlessly focused on anti-racism and decolonisation, and ultimately changing the culture of the organisation. Now, we know cultural change isn't easy. It takes a long time, but it is possible. And I like to think that Thunder Bay Public Library is an example of that. So what are those kind of next steps if you want to really transform your public library into an agency that's of social change, that's really tackling the issues of social exclusion? I'm going to break them down, the next steps, into strategy, structures, systems, and culture, which is the way that I tend to see the library world. So as you can see here, there's 3 steps that can be taken in terms of strategy. taking a long-term approach, not being short-termist, not relying on external funding, project work, that kind of thing, really embedding this in your strategies and policies. Mainstreaming provision, so it becomes part of your day-to-day, not an add-on, not something you do when you've got the money or when you've got the time, actually making it central, and then having a means of measuring its success. And also looking at resources and targeting them. Again, that key word, moving away from the universal and towards the targeted, or shifting the balance between the two, not ditching one for the other, but changing the balance. In terms of structures and systems, it's obviously working with the staff to make them competent, culturally competent, like that program I mentioned in Thunder Bay, so they can respond to this agenda. And we know staff are not always, haven't maybe not got the skill set, maybe haven't got the personality, the characteristics to do some of this work. So it's taking staff on an individual basis on a journey towards this. And then backing it up with policies and practices, making sure that you haven't got any systems in there that unwittingly are barriers, and these can be spotted very easily by asking a socially excluded person to walk with you around the library and point out the many things that we take for granted because we see them every day, but which are in fact physical or psychological barriers for people who habitually don't use public libraries, perhaps. And then if we're going to use technology, which of course we should, because it's a wonderful tool, making sure that this also addresses social exclusion. And then, as I referenced earlier, the real is, I think the hardest kind of nut to crack is the culture, which I call the way we do things around here. Every public library's got its own way of doing things. And I actually wrote a book on this in 2019, published by Routledge, called Managing Cultural Change in Public Libraries, which was just about how can you change this culture? Where do you start? What's the roadmap? What's the blueprint? What's the plan? So a lot of it's around things we already do as good practice, which is consultation and partnership working, but again, targeted at certain communities. It's about changing the image of the library, because we know that the public library is a fantastically strong brand. Everybody, even people who don't use the library, they know what when you say public library, what it means. It brings up images in their mind, but sometimes those images are not positive. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword. So maybe we need to rename our library sometimes. And I know there's been some great examples of that in UK libraries. And then I think last, probably most contentiously in this presentation, become allies of excluded people and advocate on their behalf, sometimes with them against the organisations that employ us. This is where neutrality, again, is an issue. I'm sure we can pick this up in the questions which are coming up shortly. So just to connect this quickly, all of this stuff that was done 25 years ago, which I think is still as relevant today, if not more so than when it was done, with my current research, which is basically to generate these new perspectives on the relationship between libraries and communities. What is the relationship between the public library and the community it serves? That's the bottom line question. And the lens that I'm going to use to explore that is cultural programming, whether it's cultural programming, as in the case of the Living Knowledge Network, which is done in partnership with the British Library, or whether it's any kind of cultural programming put on by any kind of public library. How does that cultural programming impact the relationship between the public library and the community it serves? And as I say, I am working specifically with members of the Living Knowledge Network. That's 32 libraries at the moment, spread around the country, all different shapes and sizes. And it's been my visits to those libraries that have given me the kind of insight into this presentation today to suggest that, yes, a lot of great work has been done since 2000. And certainly a lot of good work has been done while I was out of the country, but there's still a lot of work that still needs to be done. So this is me going out, observing what's happening, talking to staff, and drawing some conclusions, some very preliminary conclusions, which I now need to kind of prove, if you like, through the research itself. So the Living Knowledge Network, the libraries I'm working with, I am categorizing through my previous publications and experience, categorizing them into this notion of the traditional library, the community-led library, and the needs-based library. And what I would say is that most libraries are still traditional in their approach. Some libraries are very successfully community-led. Very few libraries are needs-based. They haven't gone as far as I went, for example, in Thunder Bay, in the transformational process. But these are, I'm putting these up to be knocked down with evidence, with good stories, because I haven't seen everything that's going on. This is just a snapshot of some libraries I visited over the last year since I started the research project. The research is very exciting and very positive. It's trying to prove yet again the fantastic value that public libraries add to communities, the value in terms of money invested in them, the social return on that capital, and the need to invest in libraries even more as our societies face society faces the divisions that we're seeing every day on our TV. I'm doing this research in several ways. First of all, obviously, I start with a literature review, and I've been reading as much as I can current literature about public libraries in journals, mostly journals and some books, and not just in the UK, but anywhere in the world that have been published over the last few years. And what's emerged from this literature review is this notion of the library as an everyday space, a library that people go into and use just part of their natural everyday existence. It's just part of their routine, their habits of living. I've also found, though, that the public library is viewed as a cultural institution, and there's a bit of a tension, a bit of a dynamic between this idea of the everyday and the cultural institution, which is a bit more, if you like, elite, a bit more highbrow. So I'm going to explore the power dynamics and the contradictions between those two notions of everyday space and cultural institution. And similarly, the library is a very good cultural producer. That the programs that libraries put on are often very high quality. However, there's also a contradiction between what the library produces and what the community actually wants in terms of cultural consumption. And there's another set of power dynamics and contradictions there. So this is the kind of this is the lens I'm applying to public libraries to see exactly what that relationship is between libraries and communities. In terms of methodology, I'm using participant observation, which just means I arrive in a public library. I start on the outside. I look at the building. I see how easy it is to get into. I see how many people go into the building. I kind of tailgate them in, follow them on their journey around the library, sit and observe. Who do they talk to? Do they talk to the staff? Do they talk to other people? Which parts of the library do they hang out in? How long are they there for? What are their demographics? All very overt. It's pure observation. This will then give me some ideas to explore through some semi-structured interviews, which will come in the second year of the research. I'm also looking at using some creative mapping to kind of lay out in a visual form the relationship between the library and the community, and then testing that with individuals to see whether this library, which I'm calling our library, does our library sound familiar to you, or does it sound, is it kind of missing something, or does it need something added to it? So 3 questions to go away with, and I've kind of hinted at this first one strongly throughout the presentation. Is neutrality a strength or a weakness? I think it's often been sold to all kinds of people as a strength. I'm querying that and saying, should in fact we be less neutral and more proactive and more interventionist and more of an advocate? Is social inclusion embedded in your library strategies, structures, systems, and culture? And the analogy I use here is seaside rock, you know, that sweet, sticky stuff that you buy at the seaside that's not very good for your teeth. I was in Skegness last week. They still sell it. And the thing about seaside rock is you break it at any point, doesn't matter where you break it, and you can see the writing in the middle. In this case, it said Skegness. What this question is saying is, if you break your library service, if you break open your strategies, your policies, your systems, your staffing structures, your culture, do you see social inclusion embedded in there? That is the proof of whether you are moving away from a traditional model and towards a community-led and needs-based model. And finally, taking us right back to the title of the original research, is your library open to all? Is it truly open to everybody? And if so, how do you know that? And how can you demonstrate that? And how can you prove that? So these are 3 great questions, I think, for you to take back into your organizations and maybe use as part of a conversation around management table with counsellors or with staff, certainly with community. So I'm going to stop there. There's my contact address. I'd be very happy to hear from any of you subsequent to this who want to discuss this more, get more information, tell me things that you're doing, invite me into your libraries. To me, this is the start of a conversation, not the end of it. And I've just put up on the screen some of my latest books, Understanding Public Libraries back in 2024. So I think we need to understand our libraries fully before we can change them. Then I mentioned the Reimagining Public Libraries earlier, that very much took the 25-year backward views to open to all, and then published next year based on my 10 years in Canada. Facet are publishing Decolonizing Public Libraries. And of course, we also need to decolonize UK public libraries for all sorts of reasons. So I'll leave it there for now.